today we have a fantastic lineup of panelists that will discuss the latest results of our IoT Developer Survey, which is something we do annually at the Eclipse Foundation. And before I get there, I must highlight that this session, or this series, the Head of Things, is brought to you by the Eclipse IoT, Edge Native, and Sparkplug working groups, and you can expect many more episodes to come. But let's focus today on our conversation on the results of our IoT Developer Survey. As I mentioned, I've got quite a lineup of panelists, and I will ask them to introduce themselves shortly. So, all right. Getting now to next is Angelo.
Okay, so hello everyone. Hopefully we don't have any more audio issue, so that's coming across well. So Angelo Corsaro, I'm CTO at ADLINK, and there essentially, besides the typical corporate innovation matters, I run the Advanced Technology Office, where we focus on software technology, essentially for the edge. We are very much committed to open source, and more specifically to Eclipse, where we run, I think, some of the key projects, especially in the context of IoT and Edge Computing. So it's a great pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Frédéric. Thank you to everyone to be here and listening to us today.
Of course. Next is Kilton.
Okay, so mute, unmute, mute, unmute. Hi, everyone. Kilton Hopkins, CTO and co-founder of Edgeworx, and original creator of the Eclipse IOFog project, and now just a project lead as more hands have joined in to help on it. I've been focusing on IoT and Edge since 2012, and have even had about a year and a half teaching at a university, creating an IoT program there. So been deeply embedded in the Eclipse ecosystem, as well as spending time in the CNCF and the Kubernetes-oriented ecosystem there. Super excited to talk about the results of the developer survey, which, in my opinion, is the most comprehensive and well filled out survey out there in terms of IoT and what life is like for developers. So cool stuff. And quick comment, Robert, if you put on headphones, we might be able to solve your audio issue if you have any handy. But just a thought. Cool. So happy to be here and super happy to see everyone sign up.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kilton. And yes, hopefully we'll resolve those technical issues on that side. This shows this is a real panel and not pre-recorded or anything. So, yeah. It's like running a demo. You have code and then it all breaks. It's a real demo. It's not a canned simulation.
That's like watch live TV.
yeah, exactly. Playing with no safety net or anything like that. And it seems that, unfortunately, we lost our fourth panelist. So I will introduce him, and hopefully he'll be able to rejoin us as he resolves his technical issues. So his name is Kai Hudalla. He's a lead architect at Bosch.io, a Bosch subsidiary focused on IoT, edge computing, and all sorts of innovations. So Kai is a well-known committer in our Eclipse IoT ecosystem. He's been contributing for years now to the Eclipse Hono project, which is a high-throughput message routing platform with multi-protocol support, really a very precise and I would say well-adopted piece of technology in our ecosystem. He contributes as well to many other projects in our community, and is as well a member on the Eclipse IoT PMC, so one of our community leaders, really setting the tone in our community and helping out as a mentor at your projects. And I think, Kilton, you had the opportunity to benefit from his mentorship quite a few times, as you are probably the newest member on this panel in our ecosystem. All right, so he's not there, he's not back, so hopefully he'll rejoin us, but let's get this conversation started. So I will, just as a support for this conversation, I will share my screen, and then we'll be able to see those famous slides.
I
Yes,
can
Robert?
finish the introduction.
Oh, you were cut, right? Because I had cut my own sound. So please go ahead while I share my screen.
No, just putting us into perspective with regards to the Eclipse IoT working group and Edge Native. For both, we have been founding members, and we do run 2 successful projects in the IoT group, which is Cura and Capua, middleware, and an IoT platform, integration platform. So we are a very committed company to Eclipse and IoT and Edge Native.
All right. Thank you, Robert. And yes, one thing must be said is that Cura and Capua are certainly here among our most widely adopted and most mature platforms that we've got in the Eclipse IoT working group. So it's fantastic to have this on board. All right, so now it seems we see my screen. So let's get started. So the IoT Developer Survey is really our way to really be in sync with the overall market. And in the 2020 edition, there are a few interesting findings that really struck us as especially interesting. So the first one was that in this edition of the survey, agriculture came on the top as the #1 industry that people were targeting for IoT solutions, with about 26% of respondents saying they were working on smart agriculture IoT solutions. Another interesting thing that came is that security, connectivity, data collection, and analytics were the top 3 concerns that the developers that filled the survey highlighted as the most relevant ones for them. In an edge computing perspective, this was literally the first year we had questions about edge computing in our survey. And in our artificial intelligence was mentioned as the most frequent workload for edge computing. But as you would see, there are other workloads that came very, very close to it, and the edge market or the edge space is certainly a very diversified one as far as workloads are concerned. Privacy came as a growing concern for the respondents to our survey, with 23% of them mentioning that this is really a very important concern to them. Then, looking at a more technical perspective, communication security and data encryption were the most widely mentioned techniques for securing IoT solutions again this year. This is in line with the findings from previous editions of the survey. And of particular note is that distributed ledgers, whether it's blockchain or alternative technologies like the IOTA Tangle, they gain momentum really in this edition of the survey as a way to secure IoT solutions. It hasn't been a surprise since we became, I would say, the center of gravity of the Java ecosystem, that Java has been mentioned as the most widely used programming language at on the edge and in the cloud as well, although there are several runner-ups that are very, very close to it, like Python and all. And finally, when you look at the IoT middleware space and more generally at the public cloud space, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, in that order, are certainly dominating the market, with the twist that when you look at IoT middleware, the market is more tightly packed, and the competition is a bit less close when you look at public cloud. And we'll dig deeper on each of those topics. But for now, let's start the conversation. And really, what the format for this discussion is that we'll have 4 segments where we'll have a dominant theme for each, and we'll spend some time chatting with each of our experts on the panel on each in those segments, and the others will be able to join in as well. So focusing on you, Robert, you're the Chief Strategy Officer at Eurotech. So when you look at a survey like the one we are doing, how do you extract value for your organization when it comes to a survey like that?
Well, for sure, there is always 2 main aspects of it. One is get confirmation decisions you've already taken a while back, right? So does it work in the face of the customer beyond the feedback you get every day in your work? And then the validation of decisions going forward. So where do you bet? And the developer server is certainly the closest to our ecosystem in terms of an audience. So that increased the value tremendously.
That makes sense, and obviously for us, the survey is a way to deliver value to our members in the Eclipse Foundation, and specifically in the Eclipse IoT, Edge Native, and Sparkplug working groups. Now, we spent some time covering what we put at the foundation in the executive summary for the survey, but in your own personal perspective, in Eurotech's perspective, what are your main takeaways from the survey report?
So if you follow the same pattern as before, Java being dominantly used on a IoT gateway platform confirms our decision to go with Eclipse and Java with Cura very clearly. MQTT is another fabulous story, right? And I think most of our projects are related to MQTT, and we are heavily tied to MQTT in its history. So again, it's confirmation that we get also otherwise, but it's always nice to see it in a survey. But then there is these aspects like security, right? Importance and which elements play a role. And that is something that is certainly good looking forward, as well as looking what kind of workloads on the edge compute side are preferred is something that is good to learn.
That makes sense. So was there anything surprising or especially interesting in the report?
Well, I think amazing was not the appearance of AI as the most widely seen edge compute solution or application or workload out there. It is that it came in place one. So there seems to be a lot more behind it than the hype. And we, for example, as Eurotech, have taken a very early decision to invest massively in hardware developments that enable AI at the edge.
Yeah, and I remember we discussed in one of our community meetings, you have dedicated hardware solutions, especially for connected vehicles and that kind of stuff. So, so for you to see AI coming at the top in the survey was a kind of vindication of your corporate strategy, right?
Absolutely. And also we are coming from like the very high end of this, right? So we have been supplying players in the level 5 autonomous driving market for their test fleets with compute solutions, right? Warm water cooled supercomputer blades as in system format that you can build in clusters into trunk of cars. Now we're driving a lot of our expertise down into even a gateway level. And our partnership with NVIDIA certainly plays an important role there.
So there's a shift in the way you design those hardware products and the way even that you implement them.
Oh, absolutely. And again, we can take quite a bit of confirmation out of this developers report, right? Same true for security approaches.
And that makes sense. And at the same time, no survey or even no webcast, as we saw earlier this morning, is exempt of defaults or things to improve. So when we look at the future, because this developer survey will run it again later this year. So are there additional questions or data that you would find interesting that perhaps we didn't cover in this version of the survey and that you would like to see in the future?
Yeah, I think every time we are asked, how to improve this when the survey started, and always after the surveys, we look at the data, we find out we should have asked some questions smarter. So get more details, right? So there is this whole set of questions around security. It would be great to understand not who thinks which part is important, but how many of these security features are actually to be combined in a proper solution out there?
Yeah, and this ties into discussions we've had in the meetings, the community meetings of the Edge Native Working Group, where I remember to have heard you say something like, "Oh, we at Eurotech, we don't ship any hardware solution without a TPM module anymore, because that's part of our standard way of doing things." So that's the type of insight you would like to see in future editions of the survey?
Oh, absolutely. More granularity. Also to see how some of the decisions taken, some of the trends that we anticipate do materialize. So TPM certainly is something that we have enough confirmation for, that this is the right way for our kind of customers. To now encapsulate the complexity of X509 kind of certificates in the whole software solution, actually hardware and software solution, is what we have a focus on. And there is a lot more to be done in security.
Oh, certainly. I think our respondents agree, since this was, on the top of their mind in their answers. Now, opening the discussion maybe to my other panelists. So, Robert talked about maybe more granularity in our questions about security. So, Angelo, Kai, and Kilton, what else could we improve about the future editions of our survey there?
Yeah. So what I would like, one of the dimensions that I would like to expand, and again, would be interesting to understand the other's perspective, is that today, I think the survey characterized very well, in a way, the macro trend on roughly established technologies, okay? So what would be interesting is, so we have the report today, we know where the vast majority is going, but then what the survey doesn't allow us to capture today is what's quickly emerging or what's really hot, okay? So for me, it would be interesting to give this dichotomy. This is where the world is going today. And by the way, this is also where several people are looking into going next, or without the technology they think they are the most promising, but maybe they're not using yet. So I think that's quite interesting, because it gives another angle, and in a way, allows you to say, okay, fine, this is what people are using. This is what maybe they plan to use. And so it's like what to watch and how to, how this eventually will evolve over the year. So that would be my take. I think, because without another dimension, but I think it's very interesting, especially in digging out, once again, the raw diamond that are around.
That makes sense. So Kai, Kilton, anything else that you would like to see?
I think it's been mentioned that there's probably some bias toward the kind of easily contacted ecosystems that are related to the Eclipse Foundation, some bias toward maybe Java tool sets and so on. And my thought is, well, so we have this survey that is so well participated, it would be very difficult to replicate that level of participation from some other ecosystem. So why don't we instead focus on trying to measure the bias? I don't know how to do it, but perhaps a couple of more detailed questions about the background or the time spent in familiarity with the Eclipse ecosystem, or some questions like that might allow us to say, oh, it seems like we are maybe leaning toward Java by a couple percentage points, but it's not exclusively a Java focused community that's responding here. Might allow us to get a little bit more detail about some of the leanings. That being said, as the survey has run year after year after year, it has become clear that the trends are to include some of the languages that are very AI friendly, such as Python. It's been on the rise the whole time, and so it's obviously not just a bias focused response in terms of the programming languages, but I just want to call that out publicly, that there probably is some bias just given the nature of who it reaches first coming out of the foundation, and we could probably measure that.
Yeah, and we were happy, to be honest, in this 2020 edition to see that we saw more people from other ecosystems than Eclipse coming, especially since, in fact, when you look at the full report, this is not something I have a slide for today, but you look at the report available on our website, and the number one foundation that was mentioned by respondents in our survey was the Apache Foundation as important to IoT rather than Eclipse. And to me, this is validation. We did a good job of enlarging, let's say, the audience of respondents. But you're right. We need both to continue that push in other ecosystems and try to find ways to statistically measure the bias, which is something that, yes, we need to do to provide better information to our group.
And if I may, just one intercept. So, yes, there might be a bias, but we have to be careful on the bias on the other side, which is sometimes people hear Eclipse, they think Java. While I would raise the point that, for instance, in the Eclipse Edge native, there isn't a single project that is Java-based, right?
Yes.
So there is a lot of heterogeneity now, and I think most of the new projects, at least that I'm aware, actually are not Java-based. You know, they are Go, they are Rust, and so on and so forth.
Yep, this is true. And then from a community perspective, we could treat the survey results very similar to how we treat the open source software itself. If you would like to see it expand its influence, please help share the survey and get more participants for your particular community. That's all we can ask is the community effort.
Absolutely. Now getting on with our next segment. So we talked a lot at this point in general terms about the survey. Now we'll dig a bit about, or focus a bit on the industries and workloads that have been highlighted in the survey. So in this year's edition, smart agriculture emerged as the #1 vertical that people were targeting, with industrial automation, education, automotive, smart cities following close behind. And Kilton, as someone who has worked closely in a variety of IoT and edge use cases, what do you make out of this? Was it surprising for you that agriculture came on the top?
It actually was kind of surprising. So I'll start by saying that it is not 2 times the runner-up, right? That it is all fairly close. Yeah, great, excellent. Thanks for showing the slide. But it rose pretty significantly. And so I'm going to start with a joke proposition, which is that smart agriculture rose in 2020 because nobody could go anywhere, and so everyone was just getting into gardening. I mean, we have to have some fun with the situation if we can, right? But realistically, I do think that there were some enablers for smart agriculture that have finally started to settle in. If you look at long-range, low-power wireless, such as LoRaWAN, it wasn't even open source some years ago. Semtech had it proprietary, and you had to buy their specific hardware in order to use it. After it opened, the community around that wireless technology began to grow rapidly. Well, long-range, low-power wireless is very important to smart agriculture, and as it begins to settle in and folks are getting more familiar with how to use it, it would enable a lot more products that are ready to deploy in order to enable that type of solution. So it makes kind of makes sense to me that this one would finally get its day and rise. It's also of great benefit to the planet. So I think that the ecological and economical savings of smart agriculture can be profound, and I'm very happy to see it.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, this was the first year where we introduced edge computing specific questions in the survey. How do you define the edge, and how is this different from fog? You have fog in the name of your project, so how do you define those things?
I like to give me the tough ones, huh? How would I define it? So from my point of view, actually, the definition of edge computing is pretty straightforward. Everything is edge computing if you care about the specific location where the application is running or where the data is being routed. If you look at the diagrams from the early days of the internet, the cloud was representative of the mesh of telecommunications infrastructure through which you did not care the path. And so everything else had a specific location. Cloud means something different to us now, right? It means a lot of things to a lot of people, but we kind of get the gist that there is a style of computing infrastructure that defines cloud, right? Easy scale and so on. But one of the hallmarks of that computing paradigm is that you generally don't care which computing resource your application is allocated to. But in edge computing, you do at least somewhat. Maybe it's any of the nodes inside this factory. Maybe it's any of the vehicles in the fleet that are within a certain geographical distance from the radio signal we want. But it is somehow location specific. And I would then extend that to say that although it's a little bit splitting hairs, fog computing would be more of the essential nature of cloud computing brought into an edge scenario. You have redundancy built in and failover. You have the ability to define layers through which things might transit, such as data from sensors goes into a fog layer of which you don't really care which node is doing the analytics processing, but you want it done within low latency still. So you want it in that layer that is closer to the edge. Again, splitting hairs because that is, you could have an entire, one-day conference on the difference between fog and edge computing and what the terms really mean. But for those who aren't too familiar, maybe that'll help you think it through. It's like fog is like the cloud descended a little closer to the ground, and edge is very sharply located, location-specific computing.
Okay, that makes sense. And to be honest, the reason why I was asking the question is that I was asked it and felt that my answer wasn't up to par. So now I will watch the recording for this to memorize your answer, because it's certainly better than the one that I gave at the time.
Yeah, nice.
Now, when we think about edge computing workloads, we mentioned this, or we broached the topic a bit, but the fascinating thing in this year's edition is that AI came on the top. So why is that in your perspective? Why did AI was picked as the #1 workload by our respondents?
Yeah, I'm not surprised by this one at all. I had a feeling that once all of the different pieces converged to make this possible, that we would see a rapid rise in deployment of AI to the edge. So when you think about the processing that was previously done in edge computing before the modern era of edge, it was data filtering and the type of processing, you could call it kind of pre-processing, that would take out the noise from signals from sensors, because you didn't want to send upstream data that was not business relevant or that was basically junk data, right? Is a repetition of the exact same sensor reading for 24 hours is not very interesting, so you would just only send the differences. Applying AI to the edge is the most modern and most effective way to manipulate or draw value from the data prior to it going upstream. And when you go upstream, you suffer latency, you suffer bandwidth costs, and so you don't want to send it until you need to. And then on the same point, but coming from the other side, is the value of the AI processing that we've been doing up in the cloud has been, in some cases, tremendous. You have this rapid rise of classifier AI models, which are able to distinguish in an incoming image, distinguish whether this is an actual person entering the building at a time they're not supposed to, or whether it is a rat, and something that you don't need to sound the alarm for, although you might need to call the exterminator. These classifiers are able to be applied to a number of different data types, audio and sensor data and so on, but if you need to move 100% of the data to the cloud environment to operate them, then that means you have to have very fat pipe infrastructure and so on in some cases. If you could move the intelligence closer to the sources, you would be able to apply it in closer to real time, and you would be able to have a massive savings on the volume of data that needs to be transmitted. The reasons why it didn't take off in 2016, there's a lot of pieces that weren't ready yet. We now have AI-specific silicon that is readily available. Robert, you mentioned your partnership with NVIDIA at Eurotech and how you know how to embed these GPUs into your products. There's a variety of additional AI accelerators out there. The Myriad X series by Intel, their VPUs, the Coral modules from Google with their TPUs, and my guess is that this is not over. We'll see the proliferation of all of that stuff, as well as FPGAs with their configuration ready to run tensor models or whatever it might be. With all of these things available and a bunch of models that are ready to apply to different business purposes, it was really just a matter of time before the stacks were ready, and now we have our layer cake is something that you can learn how to deploy, and the pieces are there to buy.
Absolutely. And obviously, I'm not objective there because, well, I work for an open source organization, but how can open source help improve edge computing outcomes, given everything that we said up to now?
I also am biased, but that was prior to bringing anything into the Eclipse Foundation. There are so many parts of edge computing that still need to be addressed, and challenges that I sincerely doubt could be overcome by a single organization or a single line of thinking. If we want a secure computing world going forward in which it's safe to deploy automobiles with greater intelligence and cornfields with greater intelligence, we're going to have to work together to make that possible. And nothing is as strong as the collective effort of the entire community. And that also means that it will address the needs of the community far better than perhaps one big customer, right, purchasing it from one big technology provider. And so it's the very same reason why we look to open source for all of the cloud native infrastructure, right? Is a good reason to look to open source to develop and finish out the edge native infrastructure.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense to me, and certainly open source for me is completely integral to success in edge computing, in the sense that not only the projects we have at Eclipse, but when you consider a wider ecosystem of solutions available, you have a toolkit that no commercial entity really can compete with, and to me there's great value in that. All right, so now let's focus a bit on developers. At the Eclipse Foundation, we started with the Eclipse IDE, and whether you like it or not, it's part of our DNA at Eclipse to care about developers, although now we have lots of cloud-based development tools and things like that, so it's not like we are just about the IDE, but this is the IoT Developer Survey, and obviously it's great to see the concerns of IoT developers being surfaced. So when we look at this, security, connectivity, data collection came on the top, and performance and privacy were also important and growing from the 2019 edition. So as someone who has designed and architectured a large number of IoT and edge solutions, Kai, how do you analyze this? What's your reaction when you see those results?
Well, it's not really surprising to see these numbers, and at least the trend is, if you will, steady or is the same as with 2019. In general, I would say if you ask anybody today who is serious about putting any IoT solution into practice, security and connectivity are the lowest layers of your system anyway. So without connectivity, you will not be able to get any bit of data from the field into any application that you needed to be in order to process it. So this is a must-have, if you will. So the fact that it is not rated at maybe 75% tells me mainly that this is already considered total commodity. So this is a given. You'll find that everywhere. So you simply need to have that. With security, I would say it's it's almost similar. It's just that some or many people do not get it right, I guess. So, which also brings me to the first recommendation. Don't try to do it yourself. Rely on some existing implementation of security, whatever you're talking about, whether it's encryption or authentication. Do not try to invent that yourself. You will fail miserably from my point of view. The other parts, performance and privacy, I guess when we started to work in this field, I think 5 to 6 years ago, we thought that performance would be of much bigger concern. To be honest, I have yet seen any real IoT solution that entails more than a few thousand devices so far. Based on that, I would say performance is something that people always tick because they think, yeah, it's important. It's definitely important, but they rarely have use cases where throughput and scale out is really a problem, I guess, at least today. I haven't seen it.
That makes sense. And at the same time, we see slight growth around performance, about privacy. So to me, what this tells me is that if performance is growing, people have, done their POCs, they've done their initial deployments, and now they realize, oh, I need to optimize the thing because it's not delivering the kind of performance that that I was expecting. Do you see it that way as well?
As I said, I have yet seen any use case where we're talking more than a few thousand devices. And I guess with the availability of computing resources in the abundance today in cloud environments and where we're now, that is, from my point of view, most of the times not a real problem. However, if you really start to get into the tens of thousands of devices in your solution, I guess you will run into that problem that you pointed out. Then you will probably build a POC based on a very straightforward approach. And then once you reach this, I call it the enterprise level barrier, where enterprise technology simply does not fit the problem anymore, then you really run into a problem, because in order to scale beyond this enterprise scale barrier, you'll need to do things differently. And we're talking about horizontal scale out, and you need to implement your services completely differently with much less state involved and stuff like that. So I guess people know what I'm talking about. But again, in order to do that, or to do that right, I would suggest not to try to reinvent the wheel there, but instead rely on some well-established frameworks, application development frameworks that can support you in doing that much better. And of course, following the 12-factor apps advice, stuff like that. So yeah, or in particular, when it comes to IoT and connectivity and device management, then you can, of course, rely on some of the Eclipse IoT projects, which are there to help you out there. And again, my advice would be try to reuse as much as possible, because all of that is basically commodity. That is the reason why it has been done in open source, right?
Absolutely. Going forward now with the, and focusing a bit on security and connectivity, they've been highlighted at the top two concerns. And in the survey, we saw that there are a number of protocols that people like to work with probably MQTT being the #1 protocol for people that people use, which is IoT specific. I mean, HTTPS and TCP/IP are widely used outside of IoT, but MQTT is certainly IoT specific. And then when you look at the top connectivity protocols, the fact that Wi-Fi, Ethernet, and cellular are the top 3, this has implications around security and connectivity. So when you look at those two key findings, Kai, what role does the network and communication protocols that you pick play in edge device security?
Well, I guess there are certain things here to see. One is when data is in motion across the network, do you want it to be confidential? Do you want to prevent eavesdropping on the data? That is, of course, a concern. However, that is usually addressed at a higher level in the stack and not at the MAC access level, like here with Wi-Fi or Ethernet. So in most cases, you address that with transport layer encryption today if you're talking TCP-based protocols. On the device itself, I think somebody mentioned before using a TPM or something. That is, of course, a good trust anchor that you can build upon. However, I think many people make the mistake of thinking, well, we need to implement the edge device stack or the software there once, and then we provision credentials in there, and then the device can safely authenticate to a backend or whatnot, and then we can start transmitting data. But I think in many cases this works for the first year, and then at least then you will want to start rotating keys, or your security officer tells you now you need to start rotating keys. And then I think many people will run into problems, because for small devices this might turn out to turn into a problem of updating the whole firmware, or you need to establish a site management channel over which you can rotate keys. But these are both problems that you need to address in addition to the raw business problem, where it's just about getting data from A to B and processing the data. So again, this is something that you need to have in place if you want to build up a secure solution, but this is not something you want to spend too much time on, and thus it becomes a perfect candidate for relying on an existing open source implementation, for example. Sadly but truly, though, there are not many efforts already in place for providing such infrastructure from my point of view. So Lightweight M2M, for example, has this nice concept of a bootstrap server, which you can use to rotate keys, but there is only one implementation I know of in the open source in Eclipse Leshon. But apart from that, using other communication protocols, yeah, you will have to invent something yourself. And if you, for example, rely on a TPM with a private key, and you want to use a client certificate in order to authenticate, then you need to renew or refresh this certificate once in a while, which usually entails creating a new signing request. For that, you need a proper source of randomness on the device if you want to do it on the device. So all of this has additional complications or requirements regarding, for example, the underlying hardware or the software stack that you're using. And that is often forgotten. So it's not so much about whether it's Wi-Fi, Ethernet, or MQTT or HTTP. They all have the same problems in the end. You need to get the credentials on the device, and you need to encrypt the communication. And the latter usually is the smallest problem, as long as you rely on existing implementations.
All right, and very shortly now, if we go back to our developer concerns that we had, and we look at this, are there open source projects that you feel specifically address any of the developer concerns that we see here?
Well, sure. In particular, the communication, the connectivity problem is addressed by several projects that we have, at least in the Eclipse IoT working group, where several implementations of such communication protocols are there. You could, for example, take Eclipse PAHO as an MQTT implementation, which implements MQTT 5 and 3. You can use Eclipse Vertex, which also provides you good implementations, performant implementations of MQTT 3, HTTP, AMQP 1.0. We have Eclipse Californium, which provides an implementation of CoAP, which is not on the FBI's most wanted list here, but which has its use cases in particular if you have constrained devices. So as I pointed out before, do not make the mistake and try to implement any of that yourself. Rely on existing implementations, take advantage of what people have done there. They have spent years, put man-years into the development of it. You will never be able to do it in a comparable or even better way. So yeah, simply use these. And if you want to go at an even higher level, and need a real platform for connecting your devices securely, you can take a look at Eclipse Capua. You can use Cura. You can use Eclipse Hono, which provides endpoints for several of these protocols. And these platforms already take care of also authenticating the devices in a proper way and provide you ways of how to manage the credentials, for example, and even support different types of authentication schemes. So yeah, and if there's something missing in there, be kind, be a good player, and try to contribute it to the existing projects and not write your own. That doesn't make any sense from my point of view.
Yeah, and I completely agree on that, and especially in a security perspective, as those things are tricky to get right. Which brings us to our fourth segment about tools, platforms, technologies, and you know, when we look at this finding of our survey about the top security technologies, there is some diversity there and growing interest, as we mentioned, in distributed ledger. So as a CTO at a company that focuses very much on IoT and Edge, you have a very broad perspective on this issue, Angelo. So, you know, starting where we left off with Kai and the fact that we have a very extensive toolkit at Eclipse IoT and Edge Native. So when we look at IoT security, generally speaking, what are your thoughts about this, Angelo?
Yeah, so I think my perspective is slightly different. So I like, you know, to keep track of evolution over long term. And so, you know, the perspective I like to bring is the following. If we look at the concern on security, okay, we went from 47% in 2016 to 46 in 2017, 39 in 2018, then either 37 something or 38 in 2019. It depends, I think, on the rounding, because we are not consistent between two different reports. And then 39 in 2020. If you look, on the other hand, on connectivity and data, let's say data distribution, whatever, we started at 11% in 2016, and we are to 27% today. So my reading is completely different from Kai, which is good because it introduces different perspective on a panel. Otherwise, we would be bored to death, right? So now at least we can have arguments. And my perspective is the following. So Kai perspective for me is mostly cloud-centric, or if you want to do, you know, IoT with the cloud. And I think that the trend of this, let's say, of this ranking is reflecting the fact that as we are moving from cloud-centric to more edge and so decentralized communication, all of a sudden people are realizing, well, hold on a second. Yes, security is a big problem. And by the way, security is a big problem, especially privacy, because it's growing up. But actually, if you look around, there are some key building blocks, even in many of the technology that were quoted before, that actually don't work well in an edge situation, in a situation in which you really want to decentralize computation, you want to decentralize as much as possible communication, and so on and so forth. So from my perspective, this actually security going down and the connectivity aspect going up is a reflection of these dynamics in the community, which is what I observe, at least based on what we work and the kind of domain in which we work, and obviously the fact that we really come from, I would say, the most extreme edge application, right? Just to give an idea, you know, many people are surprised that AI is the first workload on edge, but I mean, we have been even in our factory or in our customer factory delivering and running video cameras with deep neural networks to do defect detection on iPhones for years. Okay. So in a way, I think because of the domain in which we work, you know, we are forced to live on the edges and decentralize earlier than other domains. And I think we intercept this transition earlier. So I think, first of all, what I would like to share is this slightly different perspective and slightly different reading of the data. Okay, like it, not like it. That's my perspective.
All right. Thank you so much.
So. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have other questions in this specific segment. So when we look at findings 12 and 13 in our survey results, we see that a lot of people work with a variety of tools, and certainly for us, the desktop IDE at the foundation came on the top, but Eclipse, our open source lightweight alternative, came up strong, even if it's very young. And at the same time, I look at this, there are no proprietary tools mentioned there in the top results. There are a few percentages that were mentioned in the complete data set, but none in the leaders. And when we look at databases, there's SQL, NoSQL, and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, only 4% of respondents told us they are using a proprietary database in their IoT solution. So given that, how do you view the role of open source in commercial IoT implementations?
Yeah, so in this kind of, let's say, domains, so for what concerns IDE for, I would say, IoT or well, let's call it traditional IT and web or IoT programming, I mean, open source as one, right? So I think that's clear. If you look at data storages technologies, so 3% responded that they're using proprietary implementation. And in 2018, we actually had, if we look the other way around, it was 93% of the people already using open source. So from my perspective, that market, has been dominated clearly by open source for some good time. And once again, this is where, I think the market is very mature. There are lots of very good solutions to address the typical workload. And when, once again, we are starting to see, and I think there will be some rising star hopefully coming up in the next few years, but we are starting to see interesting new needs coming around, is not so much on the traditional databases. So if you look at MySQL or MariaDB or perhaps a Mongo, that's typically either for a cloud-centric deployment, like in a MongoDB, or in MySQL. Potentially, you can even embed it on some kind of, let's say, edge gateway. But none of those are addressing, once again, a key problem in edge computing, which is geo-distributed storage. And I think this will be really the next wave where we will see innovations. And this also makes a reference to what I was pointing out before, that, this, especially for this technology, we are really identifying, in a way, who is winning and where is the status quo. But it would be very, very interesting also to start looking and what's next. We have some hints around that with distributed ledger, which obviously I think are quite important for addressing some of the problem of security also in IoT, okay? Because, for instance, I think they could play a very good, an interesting role for dealing and maintaining decentralized access control information, right? But anyway, so to summarize, I think this is just constant trend. There is a big problem that needs to be addressed. There are emerging technologies. And for me, what is really exciting is to see, what will be, aside from this, in the next few years, dominating the market in the open source. And again, the transition that we will see is that there are, at least for geo-distributed storages, some solutions that are commercial, but there are, I think, some very promising open source projects that are emerging. And hopefully in a few years, we will have a very similar model than what we've seen with traditional databases, where it's dominated by open source.
Yeah, and certainly that's a trend that unfortunately our survey didn't surface, since we weren't getting very, very deep about data management and that kind of thing. But the success you've had in the Eclipse Zeno project, which really is a pub/sub protocol that supports built-in distributed storage, shows that there's a trend around this there. So can you elaborate a bit about that?
Yeah, so the point is, for us, was really user-driven innovation, because we had that problem internally. And we had that problem also with a very strong partner of ours in telecommunication, originally for dealing with 5G base station. And the problem was simple. We couldn't build an architecture as Kai was mentioning, that would scale. That was completely cloud-centric, because there was way too much data to be sent to this famous, quote-unquote central processing place. At the same, so we needed as much as possible to retain information locally, to do computation locally, but then still you want to have the ability of retrieving any data from anywhere, retaining location transparency. And for this, there weren't technologies. So we had the problem, we didn't have technology. That's why, we decided to join forces with some industrial partner and build a technology that solves it. And once again, integrating and enhancing existing database technology. So all the database technology that we have listed in these slides can be integrated in Zeno, and all of a sudden become like a geo-distributed data storage that you can transparently query from anywhere on the planet, which is very powerful, and I think will help accelerating quite a few use cases on edge computing.
Absolutely. And looking at the last findings or extracts of the findings we put in this deck, we see that, well, the IoT middleware race is still tightly packed, and obviously the usual three are the leaders there, although there was a strong showing by Bosch and other player. And then looking at public cloud, the usual three, and then they are more widely spaced. So in the context of IoT and edge computing, Angelo, what are your thoughts about public cloud versus private cloud?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, from my perspective, public cloud or private cloud, I would say use whatever makes sense for your application or your specific life cycle, right? Because when you are starting up, and depending on specific constraints, might be much easier to use public cloud, okay? You can use a combination of private and public cloud. So I think there are some natural application-specific, so architectural consideration or performance configuration or confidentiality consideration, or just opportunistic consideration of, well, the public cloud is already there, let's use it at this stage, and then eventually let's just, if that is relevant for our use case, and we know quite a few companies that have their own private cloud and use public cloud only for dealing with peak of traffic. So that for me, it's rather pragmatic decision. What is my big concern as of today, and is a concern that I've had for some time, and a concern that, just yesterday I was talking with a customer of ours, and he was raising this concern and say, well, we have been developing our solution on this vendor X or Y, I won't make name because it really doesn't matter, because X or Y, the problem is the same, platform, and we are locked in because, their API are their API. So you pick one, you can't easily move to the other. You want to span across, it isn't easy. And that's where I think open source need to help. Because, what they've done as Microsoft or Google or Amazon is great in terms of providing this infrastructure. And I understand that, their way of capitalizing is to lock you into their API. But I think as open source community, our role is that of making sure that everyone gets their fair share, but will still maintain neutrality and independence. So I would want to make sure that you can decide what you want to run, where you want to run, and whether to run it on a private cloud, using infrastructure, whatever. Offload part on Amazon, another part on Azure, and being able, to move from X to Y to Z, and so on and so forth. So that's my biggest concern, whereby, as you mentioned before, private versus public, I see it as a very pragmatic and opportunistic choice that is really guided by either some constraint that you have in your specific application, or by the life cycle at which you are in your development or deployment, or your necessity to quickly scale out. And so on and so forth. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense to me. And at the same time, unfortunately, we are all out of time, which is a shame because it's been a fantastic conversation. So Angelo, Robert, Kilton, and Kai, thank you so much for being with me today to discuss the findings of the survey. If you were watching, you saw that our deck was jumping from 1 to 3 to 7. Is that We just selected the specific excerpts out of that, but you can get the full report on our survey on our website, and you will get the full story there. And I would tease our next publication, which is our white paper on edge computing from DevOps to EdgeOps, which is really our vision for edge computing at the Edge Native Working Group of the Eclipse Foundation. So you see a URL there. You can register there to be notified once it will be published. It is this close. Our designers are putting the last coat of paint on it as we speak, literally. So we had hoped for it to be ready, but we're not just there yet. But you can expect some good news very soon. And my invitation for you in the audience would be to join our mailing list and join our Eclipse IoT working group, so that you can get exclusive access to our detailed industry research. So not only this IoT Developer Survey that we covered today, but our commercial IoT adoption survey that we will publish the results for very, very soon. So you see the links to our websites and our Twitters and all of that. So I invite you obviously to join us there and engage as well. And for now, the only thing left is to say thank you. Thank you for attending this panel. Thank you for attending this first episode of The Edge of Things. You can expect many more episodes to come, and stay tuned to learn about our next conversation and what it will bring to the table. So my name is Frédéric Desbiens. I'm the program manager at the Eclipse Foundation for IoT and Edge Computing. And this was The Edge of Things. So thank you again, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Frédéric, and thank you, everyone else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.